The phone rang at 7:14 on a Wednesday morning. I was standing at the kitchen counter of my basement suite in Inglewood, waiting for my coffee to finish brewing. November light came through the small window above the sink, pale and thin the way it always was in Calgary at that time of year, like the sun had given up trying. At 67, I'd stopped expecting much from mornings. The number on the screen had a 403 area code, but I didn't recognize it. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something stopped me. "Is this James Harlow?" A man's voice. Careful, professional. "It is. Mr. Harlow, my name is David Okafor. I'm a partner at Millbrook and Associates, an estate law firm here in Calgary. I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Harlow." He paused. "Your former wife?" I set down my coffee mug. The ceramic made a small sound against the laminate counter. "Margaret passed away 11 days ago. Pancreatic cancer. I understand you may not have been in contact. I'm sorry to deliver this news by phone." I hadn't heard my former wife's name spoken aloud by a stranger in years. I'd seen it, of course. In business publications, in the financial pages of the Herald, on the bronze plaque outside the office tower she'd developed on 9th Avenue downtown, Margaret Harlow. Harlow Property Group. A name that belonged to a world I'd been removed from a long time ago. "I see," I said. "Mr. Harlow, I'm calling because you are named in her will. The reading is scheduled for this Friday at our offices. Your attendance is requested, and given the nature of the estate documents, it's quite important that you be present." I looked around my suite, the small bookcase I'd built myself from boards I'd bought at a Habitat for Humanity restore, the folding table I used as a desk, the single window that looked out at the parking lane behind the building. Why would I be in her will? "We've been divorced for 22 years. I'm not able to discuss the specifics over the phone, Mr. Harlow, but I can tell you that your presence is required. Your daughter will also be attending, along with other beneficiaries." "My daughter?" I closed my eyes for a moment. "I'll be there," I said. He gave me the address, a building I knew well, or had known well, back when I used to walk those blocks in a suit that fit, when I was the kind of man who had lunch meetings and client files, and a desk on the 14th floor with a view of the mountains. I thanked him and hung up. I poured my coffee. It tasted like nothing. My former wife was dead. I sat down at the folding table and let that settle over me. 22 years of distance, and still her absence had a weight to it. Like a room you'd been locked out of for so long you'd almost forgotten the furniture, but you still remembered exactly what the doorknob felt like in your hand. We'd met at the University of Calgary in 1980. I was in accounting. She was studying commerce, 2 years behind me, and she had this way of walking into a room like she'd already decided what she thought of it. I'd fallen in love with that quality before I'd even learned her last name. We married in 1985, rented a townhouse in Brentwood, drove a second-hand Civic, ate a lot of pasta, and were happier than either of us had any right to be. I made partner at a mid-sized CA firm before I was 35. My former wife started a small property management company out of a spare bedroom. By the time our daughter was born, she was managing 12 residential properties. By the time our daughter was 12, she was developing them. Those were good years. I want to be clear about that. There were stretches of that marriage that were genuinely, quietly, wonderful. Summer drives up to Banff, the three of us in the car, our daughter asleep in the back seat. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market on Blackfoot Trail. The way my former wife would sometimes reach over at dinner and just put her hand on mine for no reason at all. I don't want to make her sound like a villain. She wasn't. She was a person who made a catastrophic mistake and then, out of fear, let someone else carry it. The mistake happened in the spring of 2001. My former wife's company had grown significantly. She was managing investment funds on behalf of a small group of private clients, mostly older couples who had trusted her with their retirement savings. Some of them had been with her since her early days. The Kowalski family from Airdrie, the Tremblays from Cochrane, a retired schoolteacher named Helen Rideout who'd put her entire RRSP into the fund because she'd told my former wife at the time she trusted her completely. What I discovered, late on a Thursday night when I was going through some documents she'd left on the kitchen table, was that the fund had been running a shortfall for nearly 2 years. Not fraud in the calculated, premeditated sense. More like a slow-motion panic. A few bad property investments. Losses papered over by moving money between accounts, keeping newer client deposits to cover older withdrawal requests. The kind of thing that starts small and compounds until you are standing in a kitchen at 11:30 at night, looking at numbers that make your chest go cold. My former wife was at a client dinner when I found it. She came home just after midnight to find me still at that kitchen table. What followed was the worst conversation of my life. She wasn't a calculated criminal. She was a terrified woman who had made bad decisions and then worse ones trying to fix them, and by the time she told me everything, she was shaking so badly she could barely hold her glass of water. The clients, she said. Some of them have everything in this fund. If this collapses, if this goes public, Helen put in her entire retirement. The Kowalskis. She covered her face with both hands. They'll lose everything. I was a chartered accountant. I understood exactly what the exposure looked like. I understood that what she'd done, while not deliberate in origin, had crossed into fraud territory through the cover-up. I understood that if regulators got involved before restitution was made, she was looking at criminal charges, the loss of the business, the loss of everything she'd built, and she was not the only one who would lose. Our daughter was 17. I told my former wife to go to bed. I sat at that kitchen table until 4 in the morning. When I finally went upstairs, I had made a decision. I was the CA. The accounts ran through my firm's oversight. The documentation could be read a particular way if someone with the right credentials chose to present it a particular way. It was possible, technically, for the story to be that I had mismanaged the client portfolios, that I had made unauthorized investment decisions without my former wife's knowledge, that the failure was mine. It wasn't true, but it was possible. I want to be honest about my reasoning, because I've had 22 years to examine it. Part of it was love. Part of it was the practical reality that my former wife's income had significantly outpaced mine by that point, and that our daughter's future depended far more on the continued success of the property company than on my accounting career. Part of it was that I genuinely believed it would be easier for a man in my position to survive this than for her. I thought I understood what I was walking into. I didn't, fully. I reported myself to the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Alberta. I submitted a voluntary disclosure to the financial regulator. I cooperated fully, presented my version of events, and negotiated a settlement that included full restitution to all affected clients, to be funded through assets from our joint holdings. I surrendered my CA designation. I paid a significant fine. I avoided criminal charges by the thinnest of margins, primarily because the regulator was satisfied with the restitution and because I had no prior record. My former wife cried when I told her what I'd done. She said she would spend the rest of her life making it right. She said she would rebuild, and when she had, she would take care of me. She said our daughter would never know. The clients were made whole. Helen Rideout got her retirement savings back. The Kowalski family got their money back. The Tremblays got their money back. That part I'm not sorry about. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, my former wife filed for divorce. I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it coming at some level. She couldn't look at me. Every time I walked into a room, I think she felt the full weight of what I'd sacrificed, and instead of gratitude, it produced something closer to guilt, so acute it had curdled into resentment. At least that's what I've told myself over the years, because the alternative interpretation is harder to sit with. She was generous in the settlement. The lawyers said so. I received enough to cover my debts and have a small cushion. I gave her full custody of our daughter, because our daughter was finishing high school, and I didn't want to upend her life any further. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled, I would rebuild the relationship. I told our daughter I had made serious professional mistakes, that I had mismanaged funds belonging to people who had trusted me. I didn't give her details. I thought I was protecting her. What I was actually doing was handing her a version of events with no context and no defense, and walking away from it. She was 17 years old. She drew her own conclusions, and those conclusions hardened over the next 2 decades into something that looked from where I stood like quiet contempt. I'd seen her maybe a dozen times since the divorce. Awkward dinners where she was polite in the way strangers are polite. She'd sent a card when I turned 60, a generic one, signed with just her name. No call. She'd built her own career in commercial real estate, following her mother's path, and she did it well. She had her mother's focus and her mother's way of entering a room. She didn't need me for anything. She'd made that clear without ever quite saying it. In the years after the divorce, I'd rebuilt slowly, couldn't practice as a CA. I'd worked for a while as a bookkeeper for a small landscaping company in the Southeast. Then as a financial literacy instructor for a nonprofit that helped newcomers to Canada navigate banking and credit. I'd found I was good at that, at explaining complicated things simply, at sitting with people who were overwhelmed and helping them feel less lost. It didn't pay much. It was enough. I thought about Margaret sometimes. Saw her name in the news when Harlow Property Group completed a new development, a seniors' housing complex in Mission, an affordable rental building in Forest Lawn built in partnership with the city. She'd done good work with what she'd built. That mattered to me. I needed it to matter. The law offices of Millbrook and Associates were on the 21st floor of a glass tower downtown. I arrived 12 minutes early on Friday, wearing the one suit I still owned, a charcoal gray I'd bought 4 years ago for a colleague's funeral. The receptionist directed me down a long hall to a boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows facing west. On a clear day, you could see all the way to the mountains. My daughter was already there. She looked up when I entered. She was 40 years old now, her mother's dark hair, her mother's sharp attention in her eyes. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer, a coffee from Tim Hortons in front of her, which I found oddly touching, that detail. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've prepared yourself for this moment and still aren't fully ready. Dad, not warm, not cold, neutral, like she was reading from a list. Hi, sweetheart. The word came out automatically. I hadn't called her that in years. Something crossed her face. She looked back down at her phone. Several other people came in over the next few minutes. I recognized one of them as a senior executive from Harlow Property Group. A few others I didn't know. There was a woman in her 60s who sat at the far end of the table and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. I didn't place her at first. Then I did. Helen Rideout, the retired school teacher, 24 years older, but the same square jaw, the same precise way she held herself. She caught me looking and gave me a small, deliberate nod. I looked away. David Okafor entered at exactly 9 o'clock. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, unhurried, with the kind of steady competence that good estate lawyers develop after years of sitting in rooms like this one. He thanked everyone for coming, noted the sensitivity of the occasion, and asked that questions be held until he had completed the reading. My daughter set down her phone and gave him her full attention. The first portion of the will was standard. Charitable bequests to the Kirby Center, to the Mustard Seed, to a scholarship fund at the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business. Generous amounts to longtime employees. A specific bequest to a children's hospital in her mother's name. My daughter nodded along, composed. Expecting, then, David Okafor paused, shuffled his documents, and looked up briefly before continuing. To my daughter, he read, I leave the sum of $100,000, and this message, you are the achievement of my life that I am most proud of. You are extraordinary, and you have earned everything you have built. What I am leaving you is not less because I am leaving it elsewhere. What I am leaving you is the truth, which I owe you, and which I have owed you for 22 years. The room was very quiet. My daughter's expression didn't change immediately. And then it did in small ways around the eyes, around the corners of her mouth. The composure held, but only just. David continued, to the clients of my former investment fund, specifically the estate of Helen Rideout, the Kowalski family, and the Tremblay family, I leave the sum of $500,000 each, in recognition of the harm caused by my actions in 2001, and in gratitude for their grace in accepting restitution without pursuing further legal action. There was a sound from the far end of the table. Helen Rideout had put her hand over her mouth. David pulled a separate document from his folder. It had the look of something protected, handled carefully. Plastic sleeve, heavy paper. Mrs. Harlow left a letter to be read aloud in full at this meeting. She was specific about this instruction. He looked around the room, then began, to those present. By the time you hear this, I'll have run out of time to say it myself. I have had pancreatic cancer for 14 months. I was told I had 6 to 9 months, and I was stubborn enough to stretch it. But even I couldn't argue my way past this one. I want to speak about the spring of 2001. What happened was my fault. I made bad investment decisions, and then, instead of coming forward immediately, I made worse ones trying to conceal the losses. By the time my husband discovered what had happened, the situation had become something that I was too frightened to face. My clients, people who had trusted me completely, had been harmed by my negligence and my subsequent cover-up. My husband, James Harlow, was not responsible for those losses. He was not responsible for those decisions. He did not mismanage those funds. I did. James chose to present himself to the regulator as responsible because he believed he could survive the consequences better than I could. He believed our daughter's financial future depended on the continued operation of my company. He gave up his professional designation, his reputation, and 20 years of a career he had worked hard to build to protect me and to protect our daughter. When it was over, I left him. I told myself I was giving him a clean start. The truth is that I could not look at what I had cost him and remain standing. My guilt was too large to live inside, so I moved away from the thing that made me feel it. I told our daughter that her father had made serious professional errors. I let her fill in the rest. I watched her spend the next 2 decades building her life in opposition to a version of him that did not exist. And I said nothing. That is the most shameful part of all of this. Not the original mistake, and not even the cover-up. It was the silence I maintained while she needed the truth. James, I know you told me you didn't want money when we divorced. I know you'll try to refuse this. I know you, after all this time, probably better than you know yourself. Please don't. David set down the letter. He took a breath and continued from the will itself. To my former husband, James Harlow, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all properties, liquid assets, investment portfolios, and holdings not otherwise specified above. This represents a total estimated value of approximately $14 million. The number hung in the air. My daughter stood up. She didn't say anything at first. She stood there with both hands flat on the boardroom table and looked at me, and I could see her working through it. The disbelief, the calculation, the beginning of something more painful underneath. She wasn't well, she said finally. Her voice was very controlled. She had been on medication for months. This has to be challenged. David spoke quietly. Your mother anticipated that concern. She had 3 independent psychological assessments in the months before her death, all confirming her full cognitive competency. She also left a notarized affidavit from the original financial regulator on her file, confirming the specific discrepancies in your father's submission that were noted at the time but not pursued. She left a separate statutory declaration from her own financial advisor, prepared in 2001, confirming the actual source of the portfolio decision. He let that land. If you choose to contest the will, those documents become part of the public record. My daughter looked at me. Her face had changed. Something had broken open behind the composure, and what was underneath it was not anger, or not only anger. It was something that looked like a person standing in a room they'd lived in their whole life and realizing the walls were in different places than they'd thought. You knew? She said. You knew this whole time? I knew what happened in 2001, yes. I heard my own voice from somewhere far away. I didn't know she had done this. I hadn't spoken to your mother in years. You let me think. She stopped. Started again. For 22 years I thought you had stolen from people. From pensioners. I thought you were. Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her mouth shut. You were 17, I said. I didn't want you to carry it. That wasn't your choice to make. She picked up her phone and her coffee and walked out of the boardroom. The door didn't slam. That was somehow worse. The other people in the room began quietly gathering their things. Helen Rideout walked past me on her way out and stopped. I always thought the story was strange, she said. She was very calm. The numbers never quite made sense with what I knew about your wife's operation. I didn't ask questions because I'd gotten my money back, but I always wondered. She looked at me steadily. You gave up a great deal. It wasn't enough, I said. You never should have lost it in the first place. She patted my arm once, lightly, and left. David Okafor waited until the room had emptied. Then he slid a smaller envelope across the table. My name on it, in Margaret's handwriting. She said this was private. Just for you. He left me alone with it. I sat in that boardroom for a long time before I opened it. Outside the windows, the mountains were there, the way they always were, permanent and indifferent, and somehow comforting because of it. The letter inside was handwritten, 2 pages, her familiar slanted script. James, I know you won't want the money. I know the first thing you'll do is try to find someone more deserving to give it to. I know you better than you think I do, even after all this time. I watched you from a distance more than you know. I know about the financial literacy work. I know about the Saturday mornings you spend at the drop-in on 11th Avenue. I know you sent Helen Rideout a card every Christmas for 15 years, even after you had no obligation to. I checked. You were always better at this than I was. At seeing people as people, at deciding that other things mattered more than protecting yourself. I wasted what we had. I know that. I told myself for years that leaving was the merciful thing, that you were better without me. That guilt was making me imagine things. But the truth, and I owe you truth now, is that I was a coward. I couldn't face you after what I'd done to you. So I removed myself from your life instead of fixing the wrong thing. Our daughter is extraordinary. She got my drive and your conscience, and I think that combination will serve her well when she finishes being furious. Give her time. She will come to you. I leave you this money because it belongs to you. You paid for it. 22 years of your life went into what I built, and I want you to have it back. Spend it. Build something. Go see the places we talked about when we were young and thought we had all the time in the world. Take a train somewhere. Sit in a cafe in Montreal in the springtime. Design the house you always talked about designing, the one with all the windows. You were the best part of all of it, James. You were the best part of me, and I didn't know how to keep you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't say this while I could look you in the eye. That's my last cowardice. I hope the money covers it. Yours still, Margaret. I folded the letter and sat there until the light through the western windows shifted. The mountains were still there. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. Lawyers, financial advisors, accountants who spoke in numbers that refused to feel real. $14 million. The kind of sum that reorganizes the geometry of everything. I moved through it as if through deep water, signing things, making decisions, waiting for the moment when it would settle into something I could hold. My daughter didn't call. I sent her a letter, handwritten, 2 pages, telling her the full story of 2001 inches, my own words. I didn't ask for anything. I told her she deserved to know it from me directly, not from a document. I told her the past 22 years of distance had not changed what I felt, that she was the best thing I had ever been part of, that I understood if she needed time. I didn't hear back for 6 weeks. In the meantime, I called the Kowalski family. Gerald Kowalski was 81 now, living in a care facility in Airdrie. His daughter answered his phone and listened while I introduced myself. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said her father had always maintained that something about the situation hadn't added up, that he'd accepted the settlement because it made them whole, but that he'd never quite believed the version of events he'd been given. I asked if I could visit. She said yes. Gerald Kowalski was a small, sharp-eyed man in a wheelchair, with a University of Calgary blanket across his lap and a very firm handshake. I sat with him for 2 hours. I told him the truth. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a while. I worked 40 years in the oil patch, he said finally. I've known men who did a lot worse for a lot less reason. I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry, but I appreciate you telling me. He looked at his hands. My wife passed 8 years ago. She never quite made peace with it. I wish she'd known. I set up a trust for the Kowalski family. Enough to cover Gerald's care costs in full, for however long he needed. Enough for his grandchildren's education. His daughter cried on the phone when the lawyers called her. I did the same for the Tremblay family. They were both still alive, living outside of Cochrane, and when I drove out to see them on a gray December morning, they made me tea and sat with me at their kitchen table, and Raymond Tremblay told me, quietly, that he hoped I'd sleep better now. I told him I hoped so too. Helen Rideout called me herself. a week after the estate documents for her additional bequest had been filed. She didn't say much. She thanked me, said the money would go toward a reading program she'd been trying to fund at an inner-city school for 3 years. Then she said, very matter-of-factly, that she thought I had done a hard thing in 2001 and that she thought I was a decent person. She hung up before I could respond. I bought a small house in Inglewood, 3 blocks from the river. It needed work, which I appreciated. I spent January stripping old wallpaper, repairing drywall, learning more about plumbing than I'd ever intended to. I built a proper desk for the room I was going to use as an office. I put it facing a window that looked out at a row of bare elms. In the spring, I thought, they would fill in. I set aside a significant portion of the estate for a foundation. After weeks of thinking, I named it plainly, the Harlow Morrison Foundation. Both names, because both of us were part of what had happened, and both of us were part of what came after. Its purpose was simple: financial education and legal support for Canadians caught in financial disputes they couldn't navigate alone, and restitution support for victims of financial misconduct who had fallen through the cracks of the regulatory system. I hired a small, capable staff. I found that I was good at this work in a different way than I'd been good at accounting. Quieter, more patient. My daughter called on a Tuesday morning in February. It had been 2 months since the will reading. She didn't say hello right away. I could hear her breathing on the other end, the particular kind of silence that means someone is deciding whether to say the thing they called to say. "I'm in Inglewood," she said finally. "Near the river. Can I come over?" I gave her the address. She arrived 20 minutes later in a heavy coat, snow still on her shoulders from the walk from wherever she'd parked. She stood in my doorway and looked at the half-finished walls, the new desk, the stacks of books I still hadn't properly shelved. Something in her face shifted. "You're fixing it up yourself," she said. "Most of it. The plumbing I hired out." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and she talked for a long time. She told me what it had been like at 17, building a story about who I was from fragments and silences. She told me about the years she'd spent measuring her own choices against what she'd believed mine to be, the drinking she'd refused, the risks she'd avoided, the ways she'd constructed herself in deliberate opposition to a man who had never existed. She was very honest. It cost her something to be that honest, and I could see it in her face. I didn't defend myself. I told her she had every right to be angry. I told her she had every right to need time, or space, or whatever she needed. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. "I've been thinking about what you gave up," she said. She was looking at her coffee, and I keep trying to make sense of it, and I can't fully. I don't think I would have done it. "I'm not sure I'd recommend it," I said. She looked up at that, and then she laughed, a short, real sound, and for a moment she looked like the girl who used to sit on the kitchen counter while I made Saturday morning pancakes, telling me about her week in the specific, unhurried way children tell stories when they trust you're listening. "I'd like to understand you better," she said, "if that's possible. If you want that, I want that." She came back the following weekend, and the one after that. We were careful with each other in the way of people handling something that has been recently broken, aware of the weight of it, aware that carelessness could cause more damage. But we kept at it. That was what mattered. She got involved with the foundation, the way I'd hoped she might without letting myself hope too openly. She had her mother's talent for fundraising and her mother's network, and she brought both to bear on the legal aid program with a focus and efficiency that moved things forward faster than I could have managed alone. She pushed us to add a component specifically for women navigating financial fraud within relationships, an area she'd been researching on her own, she said. For reasons she didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. She and I attended the Foundation's first major event in the spring, a quiet dinner at the Glenbow Museum that raised enough to fund the legal aid program for its first full year. She stood up and spoke about second chances in a way that was so precise and so careful that several people in the room were visibly moved. I watched her from a table near the back and felt something I'd forgotten how to feel. Proud. Simply, cleanly proud. I think about Margaret often, not with the particular weight I used to carry, but with something more complicated and more honest. She was a frightened person who made bad choices and spent 2 decades trying to build something meaningful out of the rubble of them. She didn't manage to say the true thing while she was alive, to look me in the eye, and that will always be true. But she said it in the end. I've learned that people are almost never purely one thing. The woman who let me walk into that regulator's office alone was the same woman who built affordable housing in Forest Lawn and funded a scholarship for first-generation business students, and apparently kept quiet track of whether I was sending Christmas cards to an elderly school teacher. Both of those women were real. I've stopped trying to reconcile them into one simpler story. I'm 67 years old. I live in a house near the river that I'm still fixing up room by room. I work 4 days a week at the foundation. On Friday afternoons, I teach a financial literacy class at a newcomer settlement center in the Northeast, a class I've been teaching in one form or another since I was barely holding my own life together, and I think it's the most useful thing I've ever done. My daughter and I have dinner most Sunday evenings. We're building something, I think. Not a reconstruction of what we had before, because what we had before was built on a lie and cannot be resurrected. Something new. Something that knows what it's standing on. This past spring, she told me she was expecting. I'm going to be a grandfather sometime in September. I sat with that news in the quiet of my kitchen and felt the particular vertigo of understanding that time has continued moving, that the story didn't end when I thought it was ending, that there are chapters ahead I hadn't let myself imagine. I went up to Banff on a long weekend in April, first time in years, drove up alone through the mountain pass, stopped at a pullout above the valley, stood there in the cold, bright air with the peaks still snow-covered above the tree line. Thought about the person I was 20 years ago standing on the edge of everything he'd built, and the choice he made, and the long, strange road of what came after. I don't know that I'd call it justice. Justice would mean those years back. Justice would mean my former wife alive and telling our daughter the truth herself, while there was still time for all three of us to sit in a room together. Justice is not what happened. What happened was slower and more complicated and less satisfying than justice. And also, somehow, enough. People were made whole who needed to be made whole. My daughter knows who her father is. I have a house with windows I chose, and a desk I built, and a foundation that helps people who needed someone to show up for them. I lived. I am living. On my desk at home, there's a card my daughter sent me, 2 weeks after she found out she was pregnant. No occasion, just a card. On the inside, she wrote 4 words in her mother's slanted handwriting. You'll be there, right? I keep it where I can see it. I will.